Open University.
Hi class, I'm back from South Korea. I spent the New Year, as I did last New Year, in Seoul, Korea. Had 10 days there. Really just my regular visa hop. But it's also a very interesting point of comparison with Japan, and it's sort of it reacquaints me with what's special about Japan when I go to Korea. I think they complement each other very well. They're sort of very similar societies, South Korea and Japan, but also very different. The obvious things are the pungency of life in South Korea. There's a pungency to the cuisine, of course, the kimchi, the spicy food. Just about everything you eat is either spicy itself or comes with a spicy side dish. Also the brashness and spiciness of the urban life, the personalities, the sort of fierce rudeness of the Koreans compared with the Japanese, and the dirtiness, the messiness of the streets. And I've compared it in the past to Japan being something like Switzerland or like Sweden in Asia, whereas Korea is more like Turkey or something like that. I mean, I often think Istanbul and Seoul feel quite similar in some ways. There's a vibrancy, but also a primitiveness and a filth and a spiciness and a brashness, which you don't get in Japan. My first impression on the train coming in from the airport back to Osaka was, wow, look out of the window at all those little psychopathically tidy, boxy houses. This endless suburban sprawl, which you get all the way down to Kansai International Airport. They're all houses which are like this far apart from each other and seem very, psychopathically tidy and sort of orderly, too clean, too tidy. This cleanliness is obviously a big difference. In other ways, Korea and Japan are similar. There's high density, there's high longevity. The Koreans have an even more dense urban structure. They have these big skyscrapers, residential blocks, sometimes very grim, numbered buildings up on hills, which are, like gulags. The longevity is a bit longer in Japan, and people are actually a little bit shorter in Japan. They're about a centimetre shorter. Korean women are the category of people who have increased their height the most in the last century. They've increased their height by 20 centimetres. Incredible. Really shot up and it's a part of just to do with nutrition and all sorts of other things, lifestyle, and also the desire to be slender. There are all sorts of things at play there. The Japanese actually and studies have shown that Japanese women want to be even more slender than Korean women do. But I feel it's almost, when you go from Japan to Korea, it's almost like going from North Europe to South Europe, the south of Italy or something. You get this sense of vivacity and of maybe some kind of primitivism and dirt, and a sense of fruitful garbage, a kind of creative garbage. So my main excitement when I'm there in Korea is to scour the markets, because the markets are full of this exciting garbage. And I have the real sense that if I were an artist of a certain kind, sort of post-production artist who worked on basic materials that were sort of, generated by capitalism and by productive processes in general, I would love to scour these markets and just buy lengths of hose pipe and funny little button accessories and LEDs and put things together, to make my art. And my pleasure, of course, is buying brightly coloured clothes, which I can't really do to the same extent in Japan, and certainly not as cheaply buying sweaters like this for $1 in the Korean markets. This sort of rather retro 70s polo neck and kind of aquamarine ribbed style of this very bright yellow shade of sweater here, which has a strange diagonal format at the front anyway. The back it's not diagonal. Oh, it is, both sides. this is kind of on the verge of bad taste, really, with the kind of almost sailor suit shape of the collar design there. But white always works well, I think. So, and I also found an amazing second-hand bookshop, a bit like my old lady bookshop here in Osaka, full of old paperbacks from the 50s and 60s, and so it's actually just under City Hall station, sort of in the metro station under City Hall. An eccentric old man, you can hardly open the door to this shop because there are piles of paperbacks inside, all English language. And so I bought some Catherine Mansfield in there, very interesting writer, a New Zealand writer who came to Britain, and has a kind of very subjective, evocative, poetic style. So it was really an opportunity for second-hand shopping. I was staying in an Airbnb, a sort of capsule apartment, a cockpit apartment, basically very, very tiny but very well equipped with great Wi-Fi. Of course, South Korea is the home of fast Wi-Fi. Very highly educated people. It's very mono-ethnic, a bit like Japan. They don't really deal with foreigners. And they stared at me. I find a lot of people staring at me, wearing especially these Korean pants that I was wearing, traditional Korean clothes, or this this sort of granny, not this one, wait, this thing, which is a kind of padded flowery jacket which old ladies wear in the markets. These are my style icons. One thing I did on this trip in Korea was I looked on the metro map, and anytime I saw a station that said such and such market, no matter where it was, I mean, the further out of the city the better. Places like Incheon, not the airport Incheon, but the district Incheon, which I've been recommended to visit by my friend Andeth, who's one of these market scouring and in fact market working people. She used to have her own stall called Dumpster, where she would sell sweaters which were tagged with the information, the stories of the owners, of the previous owners of the sweaters. So you'd get not just the garment but also its history. The spime, as I think, not William Gibson, Bruce Sterling calls it a spime, the sort of history through space and time of an object in the Internet of Things. She was kind of giving you that. So, yeah, she was actually in Buenos Aires this time, so I couldn't see her. But I went to these markets which she'd recommended, and ate amazing pumpkin soup, you know, behind sheets of transparent polythene. Also ate things like pig's heads, chopped up pig's heads with lots of shochu in real dive restaurants, in sort of concrete arcades that left a lot to be desired hygienically. But yeah, these people who work at the markets, these ladies who wear pink aprons at the fish market, for instance, pink aprons, red Wellington boots, and usually this kind of flowery waistcoat, padded waistcoat, because it gets much colder in winter in South Korea than it does in Japan. We hear, it's a bit like Britain with the Gulf Stream. Here in Japan we have the Pacific Ocean warming us and a kind of oceanic humidity. It's much drier, colder weather in Korea. Actually, the week I was there last week was fairly warm, so it's fairly comparable to Japan at the same time of year. But you do appreciate these warm clothes and padded clothes, especially if you're working in a market, if you're working outside. So yeah, this sort of fructifying garbage, that's really my sense of the country. And actually the places in Japan I gravitate to are the most Korean places. I don't know, I drew up a list of comparisons between Korea and Japan. I wonder if there's anything useful. Japan, too clean, psychopathically tidy, subtle, polite. They drive on the left, as we do in Britain. Cars in South Korea, I think, really are way too dominant. There's very few people riding bicycles. If they are, they're wearing crash helmets and they're riding these kind of mountain bikes along the paths designated for bikes by rivers, where people are also walking and exercising in very kind of compartmentalized ways. Whereas in Japanese cities, what you get is you get the main roads which are either elevated and therefore kind of beyond your ken, really, as a surface-dwelling city resident, or else basically you get the back streets which are dominated by bicycles, and it's very, very bicycle friendly. And then people don't wear helmets and have this kind of lycra professional cyclist mentality. They're just shopping bikes, and old people are riding them. Everybody's riding them. Of course, it's a kind of geriatric feeling you get here. When I went to the shops locally, I was amongst people in their old age, basically, wobbling around on their bicycles and blocking the roads with taxis, kind of getting impatient behind them. But at least the bicycle is king here, whereas Seoul is really it's this weird, vast megacity all sprawled out with little mountains popped up through it, jagged little mountains. So you look on a map and think, well, I could walk from here to here. It's just, it's up to the river. It's probably like a 20-minute walk. No, it'll take you 2 hours, and you'll have to cross a mountain to get to the river. It's not clear on the map. It's a weird city, but they have these 6 or 8 or 10-lane highways that go straight through it, and people are driving very fast. So I think being a cyclist there would be almost suicidal. I mean, the air pollution. There are occasional cycle paths near where I was staying. I was staying near Seoul National University Station on the 2 line, very overcrowded line where you'd be lucky to ever get a seat. Spent about an hour every day getting into the centre of town from there. Really crowded in close, and people farting on the metro, which you don't really get. I've never really encountered in Japan. This kind of brashness and the smell, the omnipresent smell of kimchi. And people staring and aggressive. So the first experience I had being back here was going to my local 100 yen shop where I buy sesame French pan. It's a kind of fake French bread with sesame seeds on it, and being almost tenderly handed my change by the assistant. There's kind of tenderness, an ambient, gentle-minded tenderness here in Japan, which is markedly different from other places. So, old population, this is Japan attributes, a tender atmosphere, libertarianism, because in Seoul, you have this Cold War structure because you have the north, this sort of villainous, almost Bond villain type dictator just to the north. I mean, when you fly into Incheon Airport, you're basically almost in North Korean airspace. Of course, they're very careful not to impinge, and you're forbidden to take photographs out of the plane window or in the airport building. There's this kind of Cold War spy thriller feeling, and also the sense of two systems which are checking up on each other, maybe stealing bits of each other's ideas, but also a tension. My talk with Colin Marshall, which you can see in the previous video in this series, he said actually people aren't really worried about it. People in America are more worried about what Kim Jong-un is doing than people in South Korea. Another thing that happened that was topical was that I photographed this Comfort Women's statue, which became a BBC News top story. While I was there, I just came across it on the street. I think there are multiple statues of the same bronzes cast from the same statue. There was one in Busan which triggered the withdrawal of some of the Japanese diplomatic staff in a row between the South Korean and Japanese governments, because these statues are protests against the enforced prostitution of women during the Japanese occupation of South Korea, or Korea in general. And there are something like 45 of these women still alive. It's a dying generation of people who remember the atrocities. But of course it's a very present and continuous memory. Of course now there's this airline Peach, which is like a budget airline which shuttles between Japan and Korea. So I was conscious of being there as almost like a Japanese tourist in Korea. It's sort of there's a tradition of sexual openness and libertarianism. I mean, in Korea there's omni-surveillance, video surveillance, cameras everywhere. I don't really know why, because it seems like a very orderly society, but they believe in watching you wherever you are. Japan, much less so. It feels much more libertarian, and for that reason there's a sort of, again, this ambient gentleness here in Japan. People speak more English in Korea, and of course Korea has been much more porous culturally. They accepted things like Christianity. I think 30% of Koreans are professed, usually evangelical Protestant Christians. They also have these military bases right in the center of town. You've got American soldiers walking around, especially in Itaewon district. There is some permeation. I think Japan has always been very careful in filtering and altering foreign things. Certainly we're very strict about Christianity, and I think rightly so. They've kept their own indigenous Shinto religions, and they of course allowed Buddhism in, but they altered it to Zen Buddhism. So I suppose you don't have, in South Korea, you don't have earthquakes, but you do have Kim Jong-un, you have the possibility of cataclysm not coming from tsunamis, but from missiles possibly whistling overhead. That sense that you get in David Bowie's Berlin albums, when you have the sound of missiles kind of in between all the tracks on the instrumental sides of those albums. The sense of the Cold War being a shadow cast over everything. A slightly glamorous shadow, I think, because it does get you away from the idea of a monoculture, a global monoculture, the idea of everybody being on the same page, thinking the same way, i.e. neoliberalism. I also think culturally South Korea is exciting. I think they've got great graphic design. If I look at Graphic Magazine, which is the South Korean version of what in Japan would be, I guess, Idea Magazine, I find Idea a little exhausted and stale. Graphic is still very exciting. The latest edition is one of designers or illustrators' sketch pads. Very fresh, very exciting. And I was sitting there reading it in the MMCA, the Contemporary Art Museum library, digital library they have there, which is better than, the whole museum there is better than anything Japan has. And they have two of them in Seoul. There's one, I went this time to Bucheon, which is in the Seoul Grand Park. I think, Gwaijong, I think it's called. The original of the MMCA Contemporary Art Museum is just as good as the one in the centre, and a short metro ride from the centre of Seoul. So culturally I find it exciting. Even films, literature, pop music, all those things are kind of peaking. In some ways parallel to the way they were in Japan in the 60s, when Japan would be winning prizes at Cannes for its films. It still occasionally does, but there isn't really that artistic desire to prove itself that Japan had when it was still relatively young and ambitious and creative. I think the interest in creativity in Japan has waned. Fewer Japanese students are going to art schools in the West, whereas there are still a lot of South Korean students in London art schools or New York art schools, whatever. So there is this interest in creativity, which of course is a continuous connection to the 1960s, I guess, in some way. Creativity being the ideology of the 1960s is something I subscribe to, obviously. And I see that in Japan sort of waning. But I still find it a super pleasant place to live, and I still... when I make these trips to Korea, I ask myself, could I live in South Korea? I think I could at a pinch. I think it's an exciting country in many ways, but I don't feel the sense of... I don't feel it's a mature and refined culture in the same way that I feel here. There's something in Japan which is very considerate and polite and refined, and this sort of connection to Heian court culture, which is still kind of present. There's somebody announcing something from the van outside. It's funny, the stats about Japan, when you see that Japan has, not only is it the longest living country, it's also the country with the least obesity in the world. It's the country with... as a recent Financial Times article said, it's got the least authoritarian populism, partly because they've always had a kind of institutionalized authoritarianism. Gosh, what is that? Looks like a tsunami coming in. Maybe that was an announcement saying, watch out for the tsunami. That would be weird. If there'd been an earthquake and a tsunami while I was doing this. Let's focus on that. I put my glasses on. It's probably nothing, but yeah, I just saw some white tops. I think it's just a windy day. Yeah, it's just a windy day. Yeah, some white tops out there just because it's windy. Anyway, yes, this has been the Open University with me blathering.
Open University.